to speak and act prophetically through community mobilization, leadership training, issues education, public witness, and public policy advocacy. In our work on Executive Council, Linda has spoken with great wisdom and passion on many justice issues, and we listen to her. She is also easy to talk to and very approachable, so make a connection with her during this annual meeting. She is connected with the Pacific Northwest as a member at Ainsworth UCC in Portland, Oregon. She also went to school at Portland State. And I didn't ask her if I could tell this, but I'm telling anyway. Early in my tenure on Executive Council, Linda was involved in a protest, and she got arrested in Washington, D.C. Yeah, she did. I was just flipped. Anyway, so she walks her talk. Please welcome Linda Jaramillo. We have a little gift for Linda, so here you go. Thank you. You know, she's preaching. She did 2 workshops, and there was another thing. Oh, sermon. Yeah. So anyway, she gets a little gift for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll open that in a little bit. I want you to know that there was no wind coming across the breezeway, so my hair's cool. And I put my lipstick on before I came up here. Who said that? You're hired. I do want to thank you, certainly, for the invitation to be here. It is really, truly a pleasure, and as you all have heard, the Northwest is really where my home and my soul is, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But I do want to thank you for the invitation to be here. Chris, thank you so much for the invitation. Mike Denton, where are you? Setting him up. There he is. Thank you so much for the hospitality. And thank you, all of you who serve on national boards and have served. There are so many in this room that I really don't dare try to name everyone, but thank you for your service, and thank you for all that you've done and been for the whole church. I do have to say, however, that Mike Denton and Chris Hansen are my bosses, because Mike is a member of the Justice and Witness Ministries Board of Directors, and Chris is a member of the Executive Council. And it is truly a pleasure and a privilege to be in ministry with them. I want to bring you greetings. Greetings from my colleagues, our General Minister and President, Geoffrey Black, and Jim Mose, who are Executive Minister for Wider Church Ministries and Global Ministries. Ben Guess, who is our Minister for Local Church Ministries, and Mark Clark, our Associate General Minister, my colleagues in ministry. And I want to tell you where they are this weekend, so that we can be in the whole church celebrating and being with one another as one people of God. Geoffrey is right now, at this very moment, at Old South Church in Boston. And there was a gathering planned many months ago, led by one of our environmental heroes, Jim Antal. And it's an environmental revival. And it was planned a long time ago, and as for many of you who watch the television news reports, know that Old South Church in Boston is just about 50 feet from the finish line of the Boston Marathon. So the church was closed for some time, and I understand that There are still barriers up to the church, but they are holding the revival. So we celebrate that. Jim is at the Western Reserve Association annual meeting in Cleveland, Ohio. Mark serves on a local nonprofit in Cleveland and is at a board retreat this weekend. And Ben Guess is celebrating a well-deserved Sabbath this weekend. So let's keep them in prayer. I also bring you greetings from the national staff of the United Church of Christ, where we all are all over the place, in Franklinton Center in North Carolina, our Washington, D.C. office, Centro Romero in San Isidro, California, Indianapolis, where our global ministries staff are, and Cleveland. And we have a really close connection with the Pacific Northwest Conference, as you know. We are joint in ministry at the United Church of Christ Center for Environmental Justice, and so we celebrate Megan Pritchard and Deej Nelson, who are all connected to our national efforts. And if you didn't know this, Megan Pritchard is the coordinator of the Mission for One Earth campaign. A special shout out goes to Mike Denton for having the vision to actually explore this partnership in ministry, to open this Environmental Justice Center. And I'm happy to tell you that we have had 3 trainings there, and Deej mentioned last night that there will be another one this summer. But it has met with such great affirmation that we have decided to spread the blessing across the country. So we are opening other centers that are going to be linked to Pilgrim Firs. And we just had a training at Silver Lake Camp in Connecticut about 2 weeks ago. We will be doing training in Denver, Colorado. We will be doing a training at Franklinton Center. And so the Environmental Justice Center has expanded. You never get in the way of God's grace. You never get in the way. I also want to thank you for your generosity, for your generous support of our church's wider mission, for sharing the gifts with us and with the world, your gifts of our church's wider mission that exceed $125,000 a year. It is truly a blessing. And also for your support of the Neighbors in Need campaign that supports much of the Ministry of Justice and Witness Ministries and the Council for American Indian Ministries. And I'm happy to tell you that we are privileged to be in partnership with the following programs who received Neighbors in Need grants just in the last year. Heroes for the Homeless of Greater Seattle, the Faith Action Network that we heard about yesterday, and Suquamish Community Kitchen, which I'm sure some of you are involved with. And I would be remiss, friends, if I didn't lift up some very special people who are here today. It's really great to see so many of you. Ken Coleman and I haven't seen each other for a while. But Ken was a student at Pacific University when I was a member at Forest Grove United Church of Christ. So I knew him when?
When I had hair.
Yeah. Marie Fortune, who is a colleague in ministry and I've worked with for many, many years. Thank you, Marie, for your ministry. And many of you who have served on national boards, but I wanted to also tell you that Cynthia Riggin, Maureen McLean, and I went to Pacific School of Religion together at the same time a couple of years ago. And then I want to lift up my mentor, my friend, the Reverend Ed Evans. Ed, where are you? Ed was my mentor when I was in seminary, and I served as a student intern at First Congregational Church in Vancouver, where Ed was the pastor. And that really was about 8 years ago. And it was truly a blessing, and I learned much from both Ed and the congregation about what it means to be a pastor. So thank you all. You know, one of the benefits of both preaching, speaking, doing workshops at the same weekend, one of the benefits is that I get to fit in whatever I might have forgotten. Or I also risk saying it again. So I ask your forgiveness if I repeat stuff, but it is the story, because the truth is this justice journey, there's always more to the story. So as we talk about engaged discipleship, I wanted to just lift up how excited I am about your vision. Justice Seekers Called to Embody Faith. Your vision, and also the theme you've selected to reflect on that. And I picked up some of these. I hope you'll see these and pick them up. And the one I picked up just a while ago says, where do you seek wisdom? Where do you find it? As we gather in this beautiful place in Wenatchee, Washington, we reflect on our call. We are preparing for our biennial church reunion. It's our family reunion, the General Synod, to be held in Long Beach, California. And our theme of the General Synod this year is God's vision. So I got to reflecting. I wonder what God's vision might be. There are so many stories in that Justice Handbook that I call the Bible. There are so many stories about the prophets, the teachers, the preachers, the leaders, the helpers, and the students, where God's imagination is interpreted, when God sends help to get us through it. So I question, does God really have a plan? A plan for us? A long-range plan, you know, for how we get through from here to there, from then to now, and here on into the next generation? I'm fully convinced that as human beings, we are incapable, do not have the capacity to truly understand the fullness and bigness of God. I think that we live into that, but our human condition limits our capacity to see how big God really is. So far be it for me to know what God is thinking, or God is seeing or envisioning. But humor me for a minute, if you will, because I want to tell some story. Don't you ever get curious about what God was thinking in the creation story? Creepy crawlers, crocodiles, bats, lizards, rats, and then there's salmon and eagles. And then there's all of that plush forest, and then there's the moon. That full moon last night was awesome. I tell you, I used to be a nighttime, moon watcher. I love the moon. But more recently, when I moved to Cleveland, my home is on the west side of Cleveland, so I see the sunrise. And I'm not a sunrise kind of girl. But I see that sunrise lifting itself up over the cityscape of Cleveland and shining across Lake Erie. And when I see that sunshine and that sunrise, I know there is a God. Those colors change, and when I saw that moon last night, I knew there must be a God. So then when I got to thinking in this creation story, what was God thinking? Okay, I've told them I would never leave them alone. I promised them I am their God. I brought them into the world for good and for evil. I brought them into the world to overcome that evil. Even in my angriest and most frustrated moments, I was going to destroy the whole earth and everything in it. But I thought it over, and I decided that maybe I could just find myself a leader who could build a boat and bring 2 of every living thing. then I would destroy it all except them. Then God repented and said, I'm sorry. I'll never flood the earth again. I'll just keep trying. I'll just keep reminding them of my abundant grace and mercy and love that is unconditional, not earned, I might add, but a gift. After all, I created them in my image. Every single one of them, my child, my relation, my family, my disciples. So then a few thousand years later, God might have said, they're not doing so well. Maybe they've been waiting, patiently and impatiently, I might add, for a Messiah. Maybe I could send someone who could help them, who could come to remind them and redeem them. They don't really understand my bigness, so I'll send them a human, just like them. I'll go to them in the form that of someone they'll be able to touch, someone they'll be able to feel, someone they'll be able to hear, someone they'll be able to see, and someone they'll be able to smell. And so God sent Jesus to show us the way to be recreated, reconciled, and renewed. Jesus made real and human form to be with us in the midst of the wilderness as well as the joy, to bring us together in the midst of our difference and our similarities, to bring us hope in the midst of our despair, and pain made real in the Good Friday, to bring us out of that lamentation day to the resurrection, to our liberation, to be the light. The same Jesus who broke through the barriers, overturned tables, shouted from the mountaintops, lived among the oppressed, spoke for the voiceless, and confronted the powers and principalities to show us the way to love one another. And so God said, hey, I got to do something. These are my kids. These are my kids. Maybe God's vision is, I'll help them build a world fit for children. Speaking of kids, when Chris Hansen sent me that first email, she listed the top 10 reasons I should come to the annual meeting. We are justice seekers called to embody our faith. You could visit the Environmental Justice Center. I didn't get to see it this time, sorry. You could meet our UCC Young Adult Service community, and I did. We've had a wonderful conversation. You could see Wenatchee, the city on the beautiful Columbia River, and you could reflect with us. And you'd probably get to meet Leo John Denton. And then I got a bonus. I got to meet Elijah Warner Cordero Duran, the dynamic duo. There's more, but what Chris didn't realize when she sent that first email, that I have my grandchildren not very far from here. They live in the Portland area, and I could stop by and see them. So I want you to know I had my grandma fix this week. Indeed. They range in age from 16 to 2, and there's 5 of them, and they're amazing people. They're amazing people. Many of you have heard this before, but for the rest of you who haven't, I must say that those 5 are not only beautiful, they're brilliant. Those of you who invite me to preach or speak or whatever must endure a story or two about them. And you, my dear friends, are no different. While they are all wise advisors and deep theological thinkers with great insight, which I call the truth, I want to share a story of just one of them, the eldest, Dylan, who is now 16 years old, Ed. And I send a shout out to Dylan for today's inspiration. And here's a story. One morning a few years ago, I was taking him and his little sister Daisy to childcare at Amy's. You see, they and their dad lived with me at the time. We were in the car, Dylan and Daisy and my daughter Kathy, their aunt. We were headed across the Broadway Bridge in Portland on the way to Amy's house. Dylan from the back seat proudly announced that he was 5 now, you know, and was not afraid of the big dark anymore. He went on to say that he had stopped being afraid of the little dark a long time ago when he was a little kid. But now that he was 5, he's not afraid of the big dark either. Kathy and I just glanced at each other with this, oh my gosh, where do we go with this? And then she asked him, so Dylan, what did you do to get over being afraid of the big and the little dark? And he responded, you just practice, silly. Unfortunately, we were almost to Amy's house, so we didn't have time to get into the real discussion about what big dark and little dark was and what that meant to him. So it goes, by the end of the day, when I picked him up, he had moved on to other things, like who won the race, the Hot Wheel race that day, and what argument he got in with the other kids at daycare. Knowing Dylan and his courage during those very, very difficult family times, I suspect that his little dark was when he had a nightlight in his bedroom. He said he just needed it to make sure he didn't trip on his toys if he had to get up and go to the bathroom. And we affirmed his claim, of course. He is now an older brother with 3 younger siblings who look to him for strength and wisdom and courage. Dylan doesn't remember this conversation, so for him, I still don't know what the big dark and little dark meant. So here I am, after all these years, wanting to have a deep theological discussion with my grandson. You know where I'm going with this, right? You know, I want to talk about it. I want to talk about it. So I want to talk about it with you, because it is a notion I'm intrigued by. I hope you are too. Maybe the little dark is the complacency that we exhibit when we dull the reality of what is going on just to keep on keeping on. It seems to me that the little dark is that which we overlook, get used to, or just tolerate and learn to live with as normal. Maybe the little dark is our random acts of kindness we call charity sometimes. We see injustice all around us and know it's not right, so we offer compassion. But it is our rush to do something. It works in the moment. It works for now. And perhaps the big dark is when things get so overwhelming and complicated that we can't figure out how to fix them or change them, and we just give up because we're convinced that nothing will ever change. When it comes down to is that the big dark and the little dark are really determined by the person experiencing them. They are in the eye of the beholder, the subject rather than the object of the story. And when we forget that, we need to practice, silly. This is the 15th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's letter to the from the Birmingham jail. It was 50 years ago that Dr. King was arrested for civil disobedience in Birmingham, Alabama. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Segregation was rampant in housing, social services, public schools, and at the voting booth. The city's brutal public safety commissioner, Bull Connor, was condoning the beating of people in the streets, fire hoses turned on young children, the burning of black churches, and on and on. While he was in jail, Dr. King got hold of a copy of an article in the Birmingham News written by a group of Christian clergy, saying that the movement was unwise and untimely. Many agreed with the clergy, including President John Kennedy. They advised that he should tone it down. It wasn't that bad. Things would get better. Just be patient. Dr. King's response was deep disappointment in his clergy colleague brethren. And that letter, frankly, did not reach a wide audience at the time. And it certainly did not have immediate impact in the heart of Southern racism right away. It was the little dark that they'd just gotten used to, just tolerated it, learned to live with as normal. Many of us were not around then, and if we were, we may not have realized how awful the situation really was. It was not until the story got across the whole country that we realized the huge scar in our social consciousness that was occurring right under our noses. The unveiling of that wound provoked President Kennedy to introduce new federal civil rights legislation, which began the era of exposure and disclosure. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Dr. King's letter to his clergy brothers, and they were brothers, 50 years later, has caused us all to reflect on the current trend as we see as a new wave of segregation in our land. In our post-9/11 world, we need only see the big dark that when states are legislating the redistricting of schools, the resegregating of communities, voting precincts to bring back separation and segregation. We need only see Bull Connor tactic being played out by Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, Arizona, where he incarcerates suspected illegal immigrants and detains them in tents in the blazing Phoenix summer temperatures in the name of national security. Yes, there are plenty of stories like these, but I'm not going to stay in the wallows of despair, because if we do, we will render ourselves hopeless and helpless to make the changes needed for these things to stop happening. However, on occasion, I do wonder, in our society and culture of immediate gratification, how often we tend to leap over Good Friday and jump to Easter Sunday. I don't think we should stay in Good Friday, but I do think we need to spend some thinking time on Saturday. Some thinking time that we can get from that place of lamentation to liberation. That we can quit wringing our hands in guilt and roll up our sleeves and get something done. It wouldn't hurt us to acknowledge and confess the part we play in the bigger problem, be it little dark or big dark. In either instance, we are called to look toward the light. Thank you for that worship this morning. Looking toward the light. And we look toward the compelling message of the Gospels to guide us. Later this morning, you will be considering some resolutions that are guided. They are guided by our responsibility as Christians. I encourage us to consider them, to pray with them, to learn from them, that we might be guided to play a role and look toward the light. You see, engaged discipleship is when we see ourselves the way God sees us, as instruments of transformation through prayer, worship, and action. Some 2,000 years later, we still struggle with the possibility that God needs us as much as we need her. God needs us to stand in solidarity with his kin. God needs us to be companions of hope and light, not as the Savior of the world, but as people in need of liberation. I'll bet that if we have each had the experience, I'll bet if we've had the experience when we think we're helping somebody else, that we really are the people who are helped. That when we're trying to change somebody else's lives, we're actually changing our own. And church, we are graced with no greater legacy than the glory of being heirs of the promises of God. The church is bound by covenant to demonstrate unity with God and all of God's creation. The church is the earthly institution among many other faith communities responsible for identifying and defining the ideology and consciousness of Christianity and proclaiming it to the world. Marjorie Suhaki, one of my favorite theologians, says it well. Jesus preached the reign of God. However, the apostles preached Jesus. We are the apostles of the modern age, compelled to proclaim the good news as we find it, as Jesus shared it. And progressive Christianity, as I shared last night, is poised to incorporate liberation values, but it must not be captured by the seductive web of power that leaves little room for individual, diverse perspectives to be heard. If we do not, progressive Christians are nothing more than any other religious movement that attempts to control the questions and the answers without considering each person's personal spiritual authority and authenticity, their truth. Jesus does shake us up and reminds us that we cannot isolate ourselves in our churches with an attitude of self-preservation and self-righteousness while the world is painfully crumbling around us. The institutional church must shift from only responding to the opinions and needs pressed by the most vocal within our congregational community to seeking a deeper understanding of what it means to be the model of love and justice, as specified in those Gospels. As followers of Jesus, we Christians must raise our voice in the public square, especially in our social systems that favor the rich, the powerful, and the dominant. Rather than asking the question, what would Jesus do? Let's just remember what Jesus did do. Friends, we have no choice, because the still speaking God we know requires that we pay attention, close to attention, to what's going on around us in our churches, our communities, our country, and our world. The church has been issued a wake-up call. 2,000 years ago, midway, and right now, right here. In this, the 21st century, the church is called to be relevant in the times ahead. And that relevance must acknowledge the dramatic changes in the demographic landscape, not only in the United States, but around the world. We are in the midst of a radically changing society that is searching for an explanation to the chaos of the current culture. Society's masses are hungry for answers and will accept almost any rationalization for the miracles of faith, regardless of the sustainability. So the words of miraculous salvation seem to satisfy the ever-present search for truth, regardless of whether or not it is grounded in scriptural examination, historical analysis, or even cultural reality. There is a yearning for truth and hope and reconciliation. We as Christians have the responsibility to influence our social culture rather than being a product of it. We have the responsibility to influence our social culture rather than being a product of it. And I will share with you, I'm absolutely sure it will cause a commotion. That's what happens when new ideas emerge and voices change. And I frankly welcome and look forward to a Holy Ghost mess of commotion. We are reluctant to use the phrase and claim the phrase to be born again. What if the church celebrated its birthday by being born again and transformed every single year at Pentecost? What would that look like? Would mainline Christianity and church membership be in decline, as it has been for the past 10 years? I propose to you that if we cling to the motion that we are born again every single day, and as individuals and the church, we might be surprised at the wonder and imagination before us. And if we celebrate that Pentecost moment in just a few weeks as a reborn church every year to remind us of whose we are, we will be surprised beyond our imagination. So the truth really is that Jesus walks among us here and now in Wenatchee, Washington. He shows us the way to be the same light today. What if we really got it? If we are the kin with all creation, we could not imagine destroying any part of it. That's what mission is all about. It's our connection. You see, if we're kin, then when there is darkness for one, we realize it is darkness for all. And when there is light for one, we glow together. You see, I've given up the word optimism for hope. Because I read somewhere that Kierkegaard said, hope is the passion for the possible. And in Jesus, we have hope. And when I forget, I just practice. Silly. If we work together, we are strengthened in our effort to live out our commitment to serve God through Jesus in the world that requires human relationships and human interaction. As disciples, we need not go out alone, nor assume that anything can be achieved through only one voice. This is that scripture that I carry with me, and in fact, it was my ordination paper. It's from Luke, the 10th chapter. I think you'll recognize it. Jesus appointed the 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. They went out in pairs. But this passage is more, it means more to me than just going out alone or not going out alone. It goes out in pairs. This passage also reminds me to go out in pairs to keep my ego in check, to keep that mirror image in check, to remind me that I am an instrument just as you are of God's righteousness and not my own. He sent them out in pairs to prepare the way. Disciples sent with a task. Discipleship, the main job, not the second job, not the moonlighting task, nor not the hobby after hours. Discipleship, not a choice, but a call. Discipleship, a summons to serve. Discipleship, sent together, not alone. So disciples, we are called to unleash the Spirit within us and the power among us to make a difference inside the church anytime we gather. As followers of Jesus Christ, we have no choice but to take that message of love and justice and hope and reconciliation out beyond the church, beyond the 9 a.m. hour on Sunday morning and the 10 a.m. hour on Saturday. How about turning over some tables? How about shouting from the mountaintops? Or throwing out the money changers? How about it? Let's go out there. Let's cause a commotion. The world is waiting. And when you get worried, just practice. Silly. Thank you. I want to be able to answer some questions. I think we have about 10 more minutes. Answer some questions. But I also wanted to read a couple of the other reflects, if I could. Then the singing enveloped me. It was funny and resonant, coming from everyone's very heart. There was no sense of performance or judgment, only that the music was breath and food. From Anne Lamont. And reflect. In the connections we celebrate in our congregations, are we willing to open our circles to new members who may change us and our circles? Does anyone have a question, a thought? Does anyone know what the little dark, a big dark is?
Can you repeat the definition of hope from Kierkegaard?
The passion for the possible. By the way, optimism is episodic. Hope is real. Anybody? Yeah.
Mary Margaret Pruitt from Fauntleroy United Church of Christ in Seattle. I would love to hear your practical wisdom on how to reverse what is certainly happening in...
Would you repeat it?
Yeah. I would love to have your practical wisdom, you know, how to address the school board, the community, about what is certainly happening in Seattle, to which you referred, the re-segregation. Of course busing was a problem. Of course it was. It resulted in white flight. It resulted in the PTA activity dramatically diminishing because South Side parents weren't going to go to meetings in the North End and vice versa. How are we going to get our children to grow up together when our housing pattern still means way too many people of Northern European heritage live in one area, better than it was 20 years ago, but still the economy and the housing are making our city segregated, and unless we figure out a way to get our children together in school, they're not going to be growing up together.
We could bring them to our churches. This is part of that systems issue that I was just talking about, the resegregation of housing, the resegregation of neighborhoods, but I must tell you that there is an element of security and safety when we actually can live in our communities that we have faith in and trust. The challenge for us in our communities and in our schools, frankly, is the differentiation of quality in our schools. And in terms of, frankly, when we actually start investing in some of the schools that perhaps are of one particular racial ethnic background, if we start actually investing in those schools and realizing that the gifts are as much in those children as they are in other children, we will create magnet schools. And we will create that environment in which children, in fact, can be together and work together. And a part of it is that the wisdom is that our elected officials work for us and not us for them. They work for us, and our key is to encourage them to think and actually make them come to church, and we can tell them there. You know, because, and many do, I'm not being, critical about that, many do. But there are instances in which this wringing of hands and this guilt notion is one of those that, well, this is just such a big problem, we can't do anything about it. Well, that is a little dark. That is what happens to us when we become new normalized. So I suggest we envision the new normal and try to figure out what is needed and check and try something. Just try something. Try bringing children together, and I agree. I mean, busing was hard on children, but you'll note in the southern areas of the United States, the children who were bused were African American children into neighborhoods that they did not feel safe in. So a part of that challenge for us, and I don't want to see kids on buses longer than they need to be. And I certainly think that neighborhood schools are important for children. But I think when we figure out how to quit differentiating and create environments where all of our schools and all of our teachers are honored for their profession, and that we can actually make some changes if we try something. Just try something. It actually doesn't cost more. You know, I've always said when people say bilingual education is a problem, well, I can tell you it doesn't cost any more to be bilingual than it does to be monolingual. And so there's ways in which children can actually teach each other. I've seen some of these cooperative schools where children are teaching each other languages. It's a marvelous thing. And I wish I had the answer, but all I'm saying is try something. Push hard. Overturn some tables. And do it. And share it. And claim it from our perspective as people of faith. And we have found in Washington, D.C. and Congress, in the halls of Congress, they are now seeking us out to get a word from the people of faith. And that is a new phenomenon. So I think the more we're in it, the more we're on it, and the more we're about it, and the more engaged we are all the time, we can in fact make a difference, and we never should believe that we can't. Silly. You practice. By the way, Dylan's a great football star. Just in case you wanted to know. Any other questions? Yeah. Somebody's going on. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Kent French from First Congregational Church of Bellingham, Washington. I wondered, as you look out over the landscape of the United Church of Christ and the broader landscape of progressive Christianity, if there are some great examples of overturning the tables and shouting from the rooftops and the mountaintops.
Let me tell you a couple of things that I think are hopeful. First of all, one of the big ones was the Health Care Reform Act. You should have seen the throngs of people of faith marching in Washington on the steps of the Capitol, and people in those offices. There were hundreds of thousands of people speaking out during that debate. And the people, the congressional leaders who wanted to vote for it and really felt the compelling drive to vote for it, said that that's really what helped them know that they were doing the right thing. And so that is a time in which tables were overturned. Now, they might be writing, the tables might be a little shaky right now, but the truth of the matter is that the Health Care Reform Act is already making a difference for some people. And so that is one of those occasions when we really have seen all of the people coming together for the sake of those who are marginalized. That is one example a few years back. The one we're seeing right now, which I think is hopeful, is the Immigration Reform Act. There is some hope in that, because while I don't agree with the militarization of the border, and I will argue that, because as many of you don't know, there's not just 3 fences in San Isidro, there's 5. There are 5 fences. When we can spend that much money keeping people apart, it'll cost about a minutia amount to keep us together. So the Immigration Reform Act, while it has that enforcement in it, it has some other options in it. For people, the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act for young people is a breath of new fresh air. Have you ever met a dreamer? A dreamer is a child who came to this country as a child and has lived only in the United States. And then now they're being told that they're not qualified for a pathway to citizenship. The executive order for the DREAM Act, I think, was that time in which we just said, the president just said, that's it, we're doing this. It's a big component of the Immigration Reform Act. And so those are some areas in which I see some hopefulness. Now, I also need to say, and I've said this before, I'm seeing, and I'm sure you're experiencing, far more movement and mobilization at the local level than we're seeing in Washington, D.C. We are seeing far more engagement in our state houses than we're seeing in the big house. We're seeing far more discussion and dialogue at the local levels, so what we need to do is mobilize our local forces. We are seeing marriage equality, 10 states, Vermont just passed it, 10 states. That to me is a command order to our Congress. And those are some of those things that we see. Another moment I saw was that when the Supreme Court ruled on the Health Care Reform Act, the constitutionality of it, we're awaiting their ruling on the Defense of Marriage Act in June. And frankly, we're expecting it on June 27th. That's during General Synod. Can you imagine? In California, where that bill is being debated in the Supreme Court right now, I will see, and we will see, the shouting from the mountaintops, one way or the other, frankly. But our presence will be known, our public witness will be there, and we will be praying. Those are some of the places where I'm seeing some hopefulness.
Bill Curlin-Hackett, is that on? Bill Curlin-Hackett, I'm a covenant minister at University Congregational in Seattle. I'm new in the UCC. 2009 I joined. I came with a task force I direct on ending homelessness, education, advocacy, and now even direct service. Pretty uninformed about what the UCC is doing nationally. In this state, we have more than 26,000 school-age children who are homeless, self-reported. We know it's higher than that. We know that we have more than 1 million nationally. We're working with people who live in their vehicles when we do the one-night count, which is federally mandated. 1/3 of them live in their vehicles. They're below the radar. I see many congregations trying to take on episodic efforts, transactional efforts, but sustained efforts are difficult for folks, and they require some collective leadership from above. So we're turning over a lot of tables at the bottom but we're not getting much traction at the top. And so what will be the UCC's voice around homelessness?
First, I want to clarify that what you're doing is at the top. One of the challenges we have before us, and I will admit it and confess it, is that one of the challenges we have before us in the church, in the United Church of Christ, is that these kinds of ministries, the kind of work that's going on throughout the country, frankly, is amazing. The leadership is here. You're doing the work. Where we're having trouble is connecting us. Knowing what's going on, knowing what we can do. We do some of that and can do some of that through the Neighbors in Need grant system. But we don't know, really, what's going on right now in terms of the movement is really around economic justice and addressing the 99%. While I do believe that we need to address the 1%, the highest, the most wealthy, I'm a firm believer, as you are, that those of us in the middle certainly cannot forget the 25% that frankly are continuing to be in the lower segment. So it really isn't about us in the middle class who are frankly fairly comfortable. It is about not forgetting. Because frankly, when the Occupy movement, there were some places in the country where the Occupy movement strategy was really unhappy with the advocates for homelessness because they said it detracted from the 99%. So I argue that, and I say that we must do something differently, and you're absolutely right, that we have to be addressing the whole realm of economic injustice and our inability to really face, to glance in the face of a person who lives on the streets and become familiar, become aware, be a part of that person's life. And I don't do this very often, but I'm going to do it now because I think it's important. My son lives on the streets. He lives on the streets in Forest Grove, Oregon, Dylan's dad. And he lives on the streets from the years of addiction and mental illness in a mental health system that is terribly broken. And a part of that is even, and I know and I have learned to understand, more so than ever before, that every person, every face I see on the streets is my son. And so I have a new way of thinking about it because I have no choice but to take it personally, as any of us do. So we actually engage. All people need is a welcoming hand, an open heart, and a willingness to be in relationship. And so I know every person who is there, the kids are in those cars, they want to just be part of the community. And the truth of the matter is, like Cameron, they also have a family. They also have a family. And sometimes families get broken. And sometimes families don't know what to do. And frankly, some families are not allowed to do anything because there's no systems in place for us to actually intervene in ways that might be long-range helpful. So I think that our consciousness, you're absolutely right, thank you for your ministry, and you're absolutely right, we must do better, much better, to connect the work that's going on in our churches, in our environments, in our communities. And it's such a huge issue around not only homelessness, but where people are now housed is in our jails. Mental health treatment is going on in the county jail. The reconstruction of our systems in trying to develop ways in which community homes can be made available, and just take one step at a time. Just do one thing that you think you can do. and go out in pairs. Don't go it alone. Thanks again.